Welcome back to Family Twist. I'm Corey.
And I'm Kendall. And today we're going to reintroduce my story. For those of you who don't remember or haven't heard, the reason that we started this podcast is that back in 2017, all I knew about my birth family was that I was adopted by my parents when I was 2 months old. And Corey got me a DNA kit for my birthday in 2017. And I immediately matched with my half brother in Massachusetts, who'd been looking for me since 1988. I suddenly found out that my birth parents were both still living. They were 15 and 16 when I was born, which is why I was given up for adoption, which I completely support. And they both went on to have 3 other children with other people. So after feeling like an only child for 47 years, I suddenly had 6 half siblings, 13 half nieces and nephews, and it was amazing.
So we're approaching 3 years of the podcast, and we started it by telling Kendall's story. What we've noticed is as the podcast has grown, I think new listeners are tending to listen to like the most recent 2 or 3 episodes, and they might not know too much about Kendall's story. So we're going to retell it, but we're definitely going to go into some more detail and share some stories that we haven't told before. Over the holidays, we got this really beautiful message from a listener named Anne, and she has agreed to let us share it with you. So here's Anne.
Dear Corey and Kendall, I have things I need to say. First of all, I really love your podcast. But I want to address Kendall. I feel like I need to say this to you, having listened to every episode of your podcast. I think your real trauma is losing your adoptive parents. I am not an adoptee, a sperm donor baby, or a psychologist. I am, however, an extremely perceptive and highly sensitive 70-year-old woman who lost her dad at 11. The death was instant. 1 minute he was there, and the next minute he wasn't. I am still suffering that loss 59 years on. I hear it in your voice. I feel it in your heart. The situation with your birth mother is horrendous, and I listen to you trying really hard to negotiate how you feel and make allowances for her circumstances. But as I have progressed from episode 1, the dominant voice speaking to me says, you loved your adoptive, amazing parents, and you have never recovered from losing them. You got lucky with them, and it is understandable that you hold them in such high regard. They do sound amazing. I just never hear any of your wonderful guests drawing this conclusion. Maybe it is because I am living my trauma every day that I am landing on my theory. But have you considered this? Regarding your adoption, I think almost all your questions have been asked and answered, and you are left with the pile of shit from your birth mother's prejudices. But be glad she didn't raise you, and however briefly you were blessed with amazing adoptive parents who left way too soon. Not too soon to mold you into the seriously exceptional person with a good set of values and sense of self-worth. Don't let that silly woman take any of that away from you. You both might be interested to know that your spread is global. I am a native New Yorker who left NY during Nixon in 1972, went to England for 25 years, and now live on a tiny Caribbean island since 2000. I have told all my UK friends about you, and you have a number of them working through your podcast. You guys have done a terrific job, and even though every episode is like a therapy session, I am addicted. Keep up the good work. Kendall, you are an amazing guy. Try just enjoying being that guy. Corey, you are a rock. I wish both of you nothing but joy and peace. Keep going. All my love and respect. Anne.
So very timely because we were talking about retelling Kendall's story early in this year anyway. And so I think Anne kind of hit the nail on the head on a couple of really important things. So we're going to start by talking about Kendall's adoptive parents, Betty and Rubel. And I don't think we've ever talked about how they met, how they got together.
Their best friends were Betty Lauderdale and Johnny Payne. And Betty and Johnny introduced, so sorry, it's confusing that my mom's best friend was Betty and she was also Betty. But Betty and Johnny introduced my parents, Betty and Rubel. And they met at a dance hall, which people don't really understand what those are anymore, but it was really common in the early 50s, late 40s for people to go to dance halls. And that's where teenagers met. And that's what happened. My parents were in their high school years going to different schools, so they wouldn't have necessarily run across each other except through their friends. And that's how they met. And ironically, the dance hall, up until about, I don't know, 10 years ago, was directly across the road from where my parents are buried. It has since been demolished, which makes me sad because when I would visit my parents' grave, I could look across the road and see the spot where they met.
That's cool.
Yeah,
So this is in Arkansas,
it is.
and Betty and Rubel fell in love, got married, wanted to start a family, but that wasn't the easiest thing for them, right?
It was not. They had been married for about a year, which probably wasn't uncommon back then. And they wanted to start having kids or have a child. Okay. They wanted to have a child. I don't know that they ever wanted to have multiple children, maybe two, but they immediately started trying and they were never successful. My mother, between the time that she was 20 and 36, had 3 miscarriages, which, when you do the math, that doesn't sound like a huge number, but it was every time they got pregnant, right? So it was devastating to them. And I know it's common for women to experience that, but my mother was greatly affected by this. And when she turned 30, the doctors told her that she would probably never be able to have a child biologically. I don't know really the details around that. I was so young when she passed away that I don't really understand exactly why they thought that, but because nowadays, of course, well, this was the 60s. So, the advances in technology that would have helped her have a baby now were not there, right? So maybe it isn't surprising that she was just told you're never going to be able to have a baby. But when she turned 30, she said to my father, we need to consider adoption because they didn't think there was another option for them.
So age 30, decided to start looking into the process of adoption. And how long did that take?
It took almost 6 years. So I was born when my mother was 35, my dad was 36. They both had birthdays before. So between the time that I was born and 2 months later when they got me, they turned 36 and 37. So, not quote young parents, especially back then, but they couldn't have been happier to get a baby.
So we're not going to go too deeply into your birth family's part of the story, but of course we have to mention the fact that you were born and given up for adoption. Do you want to quickly tell the story as to how you were conceived?
Sure, of course. So of course, as we've already mentioned, I didn't know any of this information until 2017. But it's funny because I always dreamt that possibly the reason that my parents needed to give me away as an infant, my biological family, was that they were so young. And that's exactly what happened. My biological mother was 15 when I was born. My biological father was 16 when I was born, which totally makes sense, right? Like, especially in 1970, there were many, many stigmas associated with having a child that young. Nowadays, maybe it wouldn't have been such a big deal.
So both of your grandfathers were serving on the same military base, and a supervisor there said, well, one of you just got to go. We can't have both families here with this pregnancy going on. So your birth mother's family went away and you were born. Do you know, did she even get to hold you?
I don't have any idea. I asked my biological mother and I, spoiler alert, if you haven't already heard this, we have never spoken, but her younger sister, who at the time that I was born was 13, she told me that my mother never got to hold me. That I was born, I was immediately taken into custody by the orphanage slash place where I was born, and it was never spoken about again.
Right. And you were born prematurely.
I was a 7-month baby, so today it's not uncommon for children to thrive if they're that many weeks early now. But back then, it was a big deal. I was underweight. I was undernourished. I was not well. And I actually used to joke with my adoptive parents because they politely told me how many issues I had. That, I was not, I was going to hear it in my hometown anyway, right? So they were honest and said, I was not a well baby, that I was in the hospital, I was in clinic all the time. They had to deal with the fact that I needed to be on medications and I didn't adapt well to formulas, baby formulas. And so I knew sort of what a sacrifice my parents made accidentally by taking care of me.
A little sidebar. It's interesting that you were born prematurely and your oldest sister on your mother's side, birth mother's side, her career is a NICU nurse. And love hearing the stories about, how these wonderful people change people's lives and really, really help families. And I got to spend a long weekend with Kendall's sister and 3 of her other NICU nurse friends, and we formed an instant bond. And I can't say enough nice things about what those nurses do. But yeah, so interesting that that was her career choice and not having any idea that you existed.
I even existed.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
So how did Betty and Rubel end up meeting Kendall?
So my poor parents, it's different nowadays. Again, times have changed. The expectations have changed. But in that respect, I do respect what my parents went through because it was grueling and they felt like it was overkill. But they had multiple family visits with the social worker involved in my care. And well, not just mine, with any child who would have been adopted at that point. But it was amazing because they not only came into your house to check to be certain that the electrical outlets were protected from a child being able to stick his tongue, into it, but also,
Wow, tongue first, not finger. Right?
well, finger, tongue, toe, whatever it takes. But saliva would be worse.
True.
That would really give you a shock.
Yeah.
But they also, underwent a lot of psychological testing and not just once, but multiple times. Their friends were questioned, their family was questioned. It was a big deal. In some respects, I really think that was a good experience for people to go through because it gave some gravity to what they were doing, right? I wish every parent had to go through that. There'd be a lot fewer unwanted children because I feel like my parents were deemed people who wanted a child, who were, quote, ready for, I don't know if anybody's actually ready for a child, but they were deemed, quote, worthy of being parents. And in my opinion, and I've said this a few times on this podcast, I think it's sad how some people just pop out children without giving much credence to their importance. And my parents definitely were not of that ilk.
So, we're fortunate to have quite a few photos of Kendall as a baby and as a little kid. And luckily enough, it was my mother actually asked me to track down photos of Kendall when he was a kid she makes these really, really cool collages for all the kids when they turn 40. And so I contacted Kendall's stepmother, Joyce, and she found as many photos as she could find and sent them to my mom to make this collage. Joyce is no longer with us, so I'm just thankful that we have access to those photos, those memories. You can tell in the very first photos of Kendall, like you can tell he was not quite a super, super healthy baby, but that quickly changed. And like the photos, he was such a happy baby and then such a sassy little toddler. So, we've often talked a lot about with our guests and just, telling your story about nature versus nurture. So where do you think that little sassy boy got his personality?
It's interesting. When I think of my adoptive parents, I do think that I am a mirror image of them. But because I don't know my biological mother, I don't really know her personality, that sort of thing. But from what I can tell of my biological father, he used to be especially kind of goofy and fun. And so I think of the fact that I could resemble both sides, right? My adoptive family as well as my biological family. But I don't know. I mean, when you spend 10 years, especially formative years, with your adoptive family, you can't help but take on some of their characteristics, right?
Sure.
It's just, and I feel like the characteristics that I've taken from them have served me really, really well.
Absolutely. And I think that it's important to note that just, I obviously never got to spend time with your adoptive parents, but when you and your birth dad were together, especially on the times when he would spend the weekend with us, I could definitely see some personality similarities and some like there was a bond there that was instant because of you being, blood relations. Those were really special times too.
For sure. And anybody out there who's listening who was adopted and didn't know your biological family, you will relate to this statement when I say that you don't know what you're missing. Even if you had a wonderful experience with your adoptive family, which I did. I love the Austins. I love the Montgomerys. Those are my adoptive families. My father's and my mother's, respectively. It doesn't matter. You always wonder, if you know that you're adopted, you always wonder about your biological family. And so it has been amazing for me in the last 7 years to get to know the Clarks and some of the White. White is my mother's family's name. It's been amazing to get to meet them, get to know them, get to watch their mannerisms. It seems like such a silly thing to say for a man. I was in my 40s when I found them. I'm in my 50s now. It seems weird to say that that's cool, but it really is amazing to get to physically watch mannerisms and um, patterns of speech and these things that are really intrinsic to a biological family.
So funny, I didn't remember that your parents met at a dance hall, which is kind of funny considering that Rubel converted to Southern Baptist when they got married. And the Southern Baptists, the strict ones, they don't dance.
Well, and neither did my dad. So my dad So what I should have said when I mentioned that is that really neither my mom or dad, as teenagers unmarried, were really supposed to be at the dance hall. And to the day that my dad died in 1987, he was so conservative that he never ever would wear short sleeves to church. He was very, very conservative when it came to worship practices. The thought, you're right, Corey, the thought that they met at a dance hall and were probably doing the jitterbug and all those fun things, that makes me smile, because that meant that they were, as strange as it sounds to people today, that was some subversive for them to be doing. And, the fact that my mother might have pulled up her skirt and shown her petticoat, would have been
Very
strange.
close.
I know. And this is like 1950, 51.
Well, it's an interesting juxtaposition that because we could do a whole season of episodes about your upbringing as a Southern Baptist and like it's just the length of services and all the things that you did to like help recruit kids to come to church and things like that. But while they were religiously conservative, they were quite progressive in a lot of ways as well.
Absolutely. But when I was born, they weren't quote churchgoers. They went for the important stuff, right? They went to Christmas and Easter and those kinds of things, but they didn't really go. They valued their Sundays together. If it were warm enough weather, they were always at the lake. We've talked about the lake a few times on here, but they were just trying to enjoy their lives, right? And so they were in a tiny town, my hometown in Arkansas, and they were visited by one of the local busybody, nosy women came to visit them when I was like a year old. And honestly, that woman, I won't say her name, but I remember her name. She kind of coerced my parents and made them feel guilty. She said, now that you have a baby, you should definitely be attending church. So it's funny how, well, I'm pretty critical of the fact that somebody could use an infant of 1 year old as the reason that what was I going to learn, right? As a 1 year old by going to church, but whatever. It sort of worked from a peer pressure perspective for my parents to start attending my hometown church when I was close to 2, and they felt morally obligated, even though they had already been great. They would have been great influences upon me no matter what. That's what I think listeners need to hear. My parents were good people.
So, and going back to the photos, clearly Betty and Rubel were just enamored with this little boy. I mean, there's really, really, really sweet photos, and you've told lots of stories to me over the years about how much joy they tried to pack into your life, at a young age. And, they'd been waiting to have a kid for a long time. So I'm sure they were eager to fit as much good times in as possible, not yet knowing that your mother was going to get very ill when you were very young.
True, true. So, as I mentioned, even after we started going to church a lot, they did take advantage of weekends. If it was the summer and early fall, and my dad could get a weekend day off, and what I mean by that is his normal schedule was Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday. So he would often take off a Saturday and they would suddenly have a 3-day weekend. And we went to Lake Norfolk in north central Arkansas. They had a cabin there and we went there as often as we could. And to Corey's point, they were trying to pass along their love of water to me from the moment I could see. And I I still love water, and I credit them with even though it was a lake and not the ocean. They loved it. And they took every opportunity to be swimming or water skiing. Talk about fellowship. If you were trying to quote, have fellowship at church, we were doing the same thing at the lake.
So, I mean, obviously not a spoiler because of anybody that's listened or, to past episodes or listen to this episode, they know that your adoptive parents died young. So I don't really get into too much of the sad stuff this episode since we've been, saying such nice things about Betty and Rubel. And I will ask you this again after we tell the rest of their story, but what do you think about Anne's theory that you're still mourning them? Now, we've talked about on the show many times how much we continually celebrate them here because, you're always telling stories and I'm asking questions. But I hadn't really thought about, is Kendall still mourning them?
I don't know if you ever stop mourning your parents, really. If you had a great relationship with them, I think it's healthy to mourn their loss. And I'm okay with that. Always want to respect them. I always want to honor them. I always want to thank them. And I'm okay with that. And I do agree with Anne. I feel like, yeah, at some level, even though my mother died in 1980 and my dad died in 87, I will always miss them.
Do you think the discovery of your birth family has made you mourn them deeper?
It does. It absolutely does. Because what I haven't gotten to experience with my biological family makes me miss my parents, my adopted parents more. When you are not as close with your biological father as you want to be, and probably never will be, and you've never spoken to your very selfish biological mother, completely makes you thankful for the relationships that you have with your adopted family.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So we want to thank Anne for that sweet, sweet message. And when I asked her if we could share that, she responded and said, of course you can share it. And we absolutely love this. As she mentioned, he has listened to every episode of Family Twist, and now she's like going down the rabbit hole and listening to more NPE, not parent expected podcasts. And so she wants to help. I think it sounds like she wants to become a search angel, which I think is fantastic. And so anything we can do to encourage you to do that and any kind of resources we can send your way, we will. So, but just appreciate that so much. The feedback that we get from our listeners fuels this fire. Doing a podcast is a lot of work, but it's so rewarding to have these conversations with our guests and hear from listeners. All we ask is that if you like the Family Twist podcast, share it with a good friend, even if it's somebody who's not an adoptee or donor conceived or NPE. Everybody these days knows somebody who's had a DNA discovery because it's becoming more and more prominent. The ones that people got for the holiday season in 2024, the results are probably just coming in right about now. So there's going to be a lot more stories out there. So that's all we ask. Share it with a friend that you think might appreciate the stories on here.
I appreciate the feedback from the listeners so much. I've said it many times and I'll say it every episode if I need to, but I didn't know that I needed this podcast in my life. And Corey and I have always wanted to help and help the community. And that's why we started this. But it has been so therapeutic for him and me.
And I will say this, it's, we do most of our recording with guests on the weekends just because, we're both available. And these interviews take a lot out of Kendall. He's like reliving his trauma when he's hearing people's stories. So it's a lot. Like for a while we were doing 2 or 3 a day and that was it's too much. It's so heavy. I mean, they're not all, but a lot of them are, and we can certainly, relate to the trauma that people have gone through. So it's a lot. I don't know if just us recording together is if you have the same feeling, but course, we are bringing up a lot of memories, good and bad.
Oh no, I mean today this is all positive, right?
Yeah.
It's wonderful. I love talking about my parents. I feel like this many years on, this is the way that I keep them alive for myself and for those who happen to have known them. And that's important to me. I was their only child, and I know that they would be proud of me, and they would know that I would want to continue to tell their story.
Absolutely. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the support. Thank you for the kind words. And thank you in advance for sharing with a friend.